Well, hello, everybody. I am Dr. Rachel Tate. I am in my office, actually. I'm from West Palm Beach, Florida. And tonight I have the extreme privilege of actually seeing the faces of some of our team PSA. So without further ado, I am going to let everybody introduce themselves. This is Team PSA for ACR 2022. We'll start with Olga.
Hi, I'm Olga Petryna. I'm a rheumatologist at Scarsdale Medical Group in New York metro area. And, I attended ACR virtually this year, so I'm happy to see you all as well and share what we have learned.
That's great. Robert.
Yeah, hi, I'm Robert Chao, a rheumatologist over in the DC area in Fairfax, Virginia. Excited to join everyone.
Yeah, we're glad everybody's here. Trish.
Hi, I'm Trish. I'm a rheumatology trainee from Dublin, Ireland, and really excited for tonight's session.
And you're up late tonight.
Up late, yeah.
And then, of course, Dr. Elaine Husni. Elaine, how are you?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm from Cleveland, from the Cleveland Clinic, and we had our first snowstorm already while I was away.
Well, that is some news to come home to, huh? Well, given that this is Team PSA and some of our theme has been, the best of, I want to start with, tell me your best of, or the one thing you learned this year from ACR 2022 in Philly. And I'm going to start with Olga.
All right, so my best of, and what interested me the most this year is the effect of age and gender on the phenotypical presentation of psoriatic arthritis and their response to treatment. I found it very interesting and made me think, do we have to approach patients differently based on their age and their gender? So I'll start with abstract 1234, which is the abstract that compared ultrasound findings of patients who were younger versus older, meaning younger than 40 or older than 40, and as well female to male comparison. In this abstract, they found no difference in terms of gender-related presentation of the disease, but the age seems to matter. And then they found that patients who are older tend to have higher synovitis scores. They also usually have higher enthesitis scores and more inflammatory changes seen on the ultrasound disease. It was also interesting to find out that patients who are older with psoriatic arthritis tend to have more small joint involvement as opposed to larger joints like hips or knees. And it would be interesting also to know how they respond to treatment, but that's a whole different story and a whole different study to talk about. And then similarly to this abstract, there is another one, 0377, which actually evaluated patients based on their age of onset of the disease, not necessarily age they were evaluated. And what they found in the study that patients who had the onset of the disease before age of 40 were more likely to have findings of sacroiliitis and enthesitis. And patients who were diagnosed at the age more than 60 were more likely to have more structural damage. Probably they had those symptoms for longer, just didn't know about them. They're just my speculations. They're more likely to be male than female. And they often, interestingly enough, had more involvement in upper extremities as opposed to lower extremities. At the same time, it had no effect on their quality of life or daily activity based on age, which I find very interesting as well. But all in all, it seems like, disease is not necessarily the same when we are younger or older. And then maybe it makes sense to reevaluate those patients, as they progress in life with their disease. What do you think?
I think that's really interesting. Trish, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big kind of advocate for appreciating aging in rheumatic diseases. That's my area of research interest. So I definitely think, we're dealing with a totally different ball game, dealing with like patients over 65 versus younger. And I think this study even supports it and how they present, like there is a difference. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. And as Olga was saying, I think there's just more research to be done in this area. I think we're only beginning to understand it.
Well, it's funny, there was a trend even a couple of years ago where we started talking about the 5 M's as it relates to rheumatology and kind of the bridging with gerontology. So I really like these types of studies because I think it really allows us to have more confidence in how we see patients. Robert, are you seeing any of these types of changes in your clinical practice based on what Olga was just talking about?
Yeah, I think not just the changes, but also, I'm not sure about you guys, but also how these patients approach their goals of care with me. For example, if I see a 50, 60-year-old patient with nuance or newly diagnosed, let's say, psoriatic arthritis, mine and sometimes their approach is perhaps not complete prevention, because they've probably come to me with already some complications and sequelae, versus the 19-year-old, the 20-year-old. We're trying to be as aggressive as we can, and their substrate, like their comorbidities or lack thereof, allow us to be much more aggressive, versus someone who maybe doesn't want us to be as aggressive, and also doesn't want to sort of be subjected to those kind of biologics and immunotherapies, especially sometimes, obviously during a pandemic.
And I think as well that feeds into, what is your target? What are you treating to? Like for an 8-year-old woman, it might be just that she's able to do her own little bit of cooking at home versus our aggressive treat to target in her younger. So I think that's definitely something as well that we need to consider.
Beautifully stated.
Yeah, I think, what's great in this meeting, this theme that Olga just kind of taught us is that subgroup analysis are important, right? Like, we're beginning to be more personalized, which is what I love, right? We now have frameworks, not one size fits all. So kind of exciting.
It is exciting. Robert, did you want to go ahead and go?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm going to touch upon a subject that I think a lot of us, again, face in clinic. It's what do you do with psoriatic arthritis patients, or really any patients, but today, of course, focusing on psoriatic arthritis patients, when they don't respond to the first line biologic. In this case, it's the TNF inhibitors. So this was, I think, one of the few abstracts focusing on whether you should cycle or switch biologics, and this was abstract 1600. This study was, using the Core Evitas registry, which I think previously used to be called Corona. And they had almost 400 patients, 394 patients. And of course, either first line TNF inhibitor switching to another non-TNF inhibitor, or cycling to a second line TNF inhibitor. They did find some trends, the keyword is trends. They found that at 6-month follow-up, the switchers, the people who switched to a non-TNF inhibitor, did have an increased likelihood of achieving all clinical outcomes. They actually had about a 70% greater likelihood of achieving minimal disease activity, also 4 times higher likelihood of achieving the SPARC index for enthesitis. But there was also some decent response with the cyclers. So I think, Elaine will also talk about later that, I think at this point, I don't think we have concrete evidence on exactly what to do with biologics in the world of psoriatic arthritis. I think one thing that really stuck with me was what Dr. Eric Rudderman said from, I think, some either 1 or 2 ACRs ago, which is a biologic is a biologic is a biologic in psoriatic arthritis. I don't think we have quite the tools necessary to determine which one is the best for you. And even if we did, I think besides skin, but even if we did, most of the time we are kind of restrained by what insurance companies will allow us to prescribe anyway.
That's true.
So maybe I can quickly talk about mine since it follows Robert's, and then we can discuss it. But my abstract that I want to talk about is 2149. And that, again, just like Robert's theme, cycling versus swapping strategies in PSA. And this one is from a Portuguese registry. And it's Dr. Glomeris and colleagues. And the reason I picked this one, because I know this has been, as Robert had mentioned, a hot topic. This one was rather large, more, about 450 patients, and they had nice long-term follow-up. So that's why I chose this one out to 24 months. And same as Robert said, whether or not after your first failure, are you, cycling through the same class, another TNF inhibitor, for example, or are we swapping a new mechanism of action? And this one was looking at secukinumab or ustekinumab. And after 2 years, which is a little different than Robert's abstract, this one showed that the retention rates were similar. Didn't matter. So, I just thought that's nice that we contrasted some of this. So even though we want we want the best algorithm, we want the recipe of what to do next. seems like the data is not supporting one or the other, but love to hear what you guys think.
Yeah, Trish, you had a comment. What were you going to say?
Yeah, so I don't know. I just think even for patients, like obviously the number of therapeutics we have available to us in psoriatic arthritis keeps increasing. So I think, even to go to a patient and say, okay, you were on, say, a TNF and now that didn't work, so we're switching totally to a totally different mechanism. I think there's something in that for the patient even, but, it is definitely reassuring. Elaine's study, I think that's, as you were saying, 2-year follow-up, larger group. We have the option of staying and cycling as well. So yeah, it's interesting.
Olga?
Yeah, and it's interesting. That question interests me as well during the meeting, and actually ran the poll on Twitter. I asked people what do they actually do in their practices, and 77% of the people said they're switching to a different mechanism, and only 23 said they stay and cycle TNFs. So yeah, but still, we need to learn.
I want to do that subgroup analysis too of who's staying and why. I think it's
Right.
because as Robert mentioned earlier, we sometimes have pre-described algorithms through not pharmaceutical companies, pardon me, but through insurance, through payers. And so you feel a little bit maybe hammered by that. And I think that can be part of what's contributing too.
I think in Ireland, we're actually quite lucky. We aren't as restrained by that. We don't have the same availability, but we're not as tied by insurance companies. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a push to want to do a different mechanism of action just because we have so much. It's like, candy store. It's like, okay, why don't we just try another? So I guess this one struck me because it really didn't show a different retention rate. So maybe we should be keeping them because, they have a long way to go with this disease because we don't have a cure. So maybe we shouldn't, such a hot potato, keep switching. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. Maybe stay within class, and then if they really non-responder, you go.
Well, I think that's true, right? If it's a non-responder versus a lack of response or loss of response, right? So,
Right.
Robert, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I practice a little bit conservatively. I tell patients, if there's any response, at all, because I feel like if we just hop classes from TNFs to whatever, IL-17, then we kind of give up on the other 4 TNFs, So if there's any response, perhaps there's a slightly better response with the other TNF. And I think, these studies are all obviously, both mine and yours were retrospective using large registries. I'm not sure about yours, but I forgot to mention for mine, the switchers already had a baseline worse disease activity. So these perhaps are patients who are already set up planning to switch anyway. And you're just looking at what happens when you plan to switch anyway. So always difficult, with retrospective studies. And I think on your studies, especially with looking at, IL-1223 versus IL-17, perhaps that's just the study showing how similar they are instead of, comparing to TNF inhibitors. So all these are tricky. I think, again, I know there are some precision medicine studies in the works for psoriatic arthritis, but until we have concrete evidence, these are interesting, still sparks of conversation, but I think for real life practical purposes, unclear. And then at the end of the day, who will pay for the med? I think that's very important.
So that's my question to both of you. Does this change how you practice?
Probably not. But interesting. I mean, there's 2 things I'm always looking at conferences was what to do with these kind of patients, because these are real life practical questions. And also for me personally, just gut microbiome, that's a separate discussion for another day.
Yeah, I like Robert's term, conservative. I think the way sometimes we practice, like we either fall in that conservative group or we kind of fall in that new is better group. So obviously no right or wrong answer. I am probably on the more conservative side because I feel like they have a long way to go. Obviously, if they're primary non-responders, I probably switch faster for sure. But if that is that partial responder, I think I might give it another try. But like I said, two schools, right? Conservative versus the more progressive group. So.
Absolutely. Trish, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So absolutely, there was so many abstracts this year. The one that stood out to me most, and I think that kind of stuck with me throughout, was abstract 1044. So this was by Prof. Leahy Eder and our colleagues in the University of Toronto. So this was a preliminary analysis of the DIPSA study. So the DIPSA study is looking at the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet versus standard diet in those with psoriatic arthritis. So this preliminary analysis just aimed to look at the dietary patterns and the metabolic factors of the patients who've been enrolled to date. So I think there's 32 patients enrolled, and the results to me anyway were just shocking. So 71% of patients were overweight. So that's just under 3/4 of patients, and 47% had metabolic disorder. So that's just under 50%. And then the interesting part was the correlated dietary patterns with disease outcomes. So what they showed was those who had lower sugar intake had lower fatigue and lower PZ scores. On the reverse of that, those who had increased saturated fat intake had increased enthesitis scores. Patients who ate more whole fruits had reduced tender joint counts. So this for me highlighted, I think, two main things. So the first thing is, obesity and metabolic syndrome is a very real, very highly prevalent thing in psoriatic arthritis. I think we need to increase our awareness, increase our detection of this in our patients. It's something that we maybe sometimes ignore. And the second thing is, we are what we eat. I definitely think when it comes to psoriatic arthritis anyway, it does seem like what is in our diet, our disease activity responds to that. So I think studies like the DIPSA, we really need them. I don't know about you guys, but when I get asked in clinic, oh, doctor, is there certain food I should add to my diet, or is there certain diet I should be, we kind of sweat a little bit because the evidence base just isn't there. So I think I'm really looking forward to the results of the DIPSA and the impact that they have. I'd be interested to see your guys' opinion on it, obviously as an adjunct to our conventional care, but yeah.
And they're still enrolling, right?
So they're still enrolling, I think, and even now numbers are a lot higher, but that was just the initial kind of cohort that they had, and they did the analysis on it. Yeah.
Do you know how they judge, Trish, how they judge sort of compliance with one over the other? How do they, is it just ask them?
Yeah, so this abstract actually didn't go into that. It wasn't about the actual study that's ongoing. It was more the analysis of the initial patients that they'd enrolled. So the dietary that they were looking for, it was in retrospect, say when they were initially enrolled over the last week, their compliance with sugar, etc. So the actual compliance with the Mediterranean or DASH, they haven't gone into that yet.
Because I feel like anyone can do anything for a couple weeks, and then I, including myself. Yeah. So I'm just picking my personal experience. How do they get those patients to stay on?
Yeah. But I think even if we show anything from it, I think if you have an evidence base for your patients in clinic, if you say, well, in this study, these patients, did this, and look at the domains that improved, I think it would at least provide a lot more motivation for patients anyway.
For sure.
Yeah.
Do you have those patients, anybody, do you have those patients who stop sugar and feel better in terms of their fatigue? That's what I found really interesting about this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So
I think a lot of people say that, yes, that they adjust their diet, they do feel better. We don't know if it's placebo effect or not, but they do.
Have you ever tried to stop sugar?
I would feel sad personally, but yeah. But interesting.
Yeah, it's hard because, if you make these big shifts in your diet, I also find that they make big shifts in other things. They start moving more, they start being very health conscious. So I think those non-contributor factors are difficult to tease out sometimes, because the minute you make these big changes, don't you feel like, you'll sleep better, you'll have some positive energy, right? So I think for me, a lot of these diet studies, which I think is really important to study, as you said, Trish, I also think we have to do better at understanding compliance and continuity, longevity of doing these changes. I think that's where that motivational behavior component becomes really important, which none of us as rheumatologists are probably in that field, but something we need to grab them over and help us.
Yeah, I agree. I think the two big things you hit upon are big and compliance, really, because I tell patients today, I get this question almost every day: what diet, what food, what should I eat or not eat? And I just say the blunt truth. I mean, listen, if I tell you today to change your diet completely, it's very rare it's going to happen. And it's going to very rare. It's going to stick with you for forever because you've been eating like this for 30, 40, 50 years. It's probably not going to change tomorrow, but baby steps. If your vice is potato chips like mine, try to cut those out. If your vice is lots of sugars, try to cut those out. And then, for me personally, like you mentioned, I know if I work out in the morning, I'm probably not reaching for ice cream later on. Today had a long clinic day. So before this, Tricia, you just said, you are what you eat. I just had meatloaf before this meeting. So I hope I am not meatloaf, but when you have a tough day, sometimes some comfort food, goes a long way. So, and I think those baby steps will eventually lead to bigger steps. And then I think that's where compliance kicks in. And I think that's why we see so many different diets every decade, every 5 years. Atkins, keto, whatever, is because people can't stick to them. You try them for a little bit and then you go back to what you're doing and you try a new diet and you kind of yo-yo your weight back and forth. But yeah, I think if we can somehow figure those two out, we can make some big changes.
I do think the reason they chose the Mediterranean in the diet, though, it isn't necessarily like low calorie, it's more the foods that you're eating. So I do think they were quite mindful of that in it, but absolutely, yeah, compliance is it going forward.
My short answer to patients is always just Mediterranean diet. I think that is probably the prototypical best one, if you will.
Exactly what's in it. I'm not 100%, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Mediterranean diet really stresses that plant-based foods, olive oils, nuts and seeds and plants. I think that really distinguishes it from the other diets.
Well, and I also think that from an obesity itself standpoint, obesity increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. There are all sorts of other risk factors, let alone their psoriatic disease. So when you find something that works for one patient, especially when it comes to something they can be compliant with, I think the Mediterranean diet, it sounds less scary to a patient, right? It sounds a little more like, okay, maybe I can introduce olive oil instead of vegetable oil. Like there are certain things, I can still have carbs. You start kind of meeting that patient where they're at. And you're right. When we make these lifestyle changes, we may stop smoking. We may get better sleep. Like it shifts the entire paradigm. So I think it's that this is going to be one to study and one to watch for me too, Trish. I think that's true. Now, I know Elaine had one more really great abstract. Can you tell us about that one?
Sure. Do we have time?
Yeah, we definitely have time.
All right. So it's abstract 1487. I'm just going to change you a little because it's a little more basic science-y, but kind of maybe important for us clinically. It's differentiation of therapeutic antibodies targeting interleukin 23. So this was really interesting. It was by James Kruger, Dennis McGonigal's group, and maybe you've looked over it, but it was in this poster session on Sunday. And it looked at the relative, sort of important differences maybe between the two different IL-23, so between guselkumab and risankizumab. So many of us know that, within class, you would think, they all have the same potency, efficacy that got its FDA approval. But this study looked specifically at the FC portion and showed some interesting differences between guselkumab and risankizumab. And so the FC region, interesting that in guselkumab, one was a crystallized FC region and the other one was a mutated FC region. You can read the abstract to have more details on that. But the bottom line is that guselkumab has more affinity to the CD24 positive myeloid cells. And why that's important is because we also know that patients can be enriched when their skin is actively inflamed. So could we make a conclusion that guselkumab perhaps binds to these inflamed areas a little bit tighter and maybe a molecular difference that we see within class? So obviously early data, but whether or not this may lead to a more durable response, I just thought what an interesting concept, because most of us just kind of throw within class altogether. And now there's some molecular changes that we can start thinking about. So this is sort of a translational study that also can maybe change the way clinically we may think about choosing. So just like Robert and I were just thinking about cycling versus swapping, that's why I kind of added this one, like, hey, maybe if our technology gets better, we may be able to look at more between class differences to help explain some of the durability of responses. But wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, isn't this the golden ticket? We want to know, right? Even in between classes, this is really the crux of what we do. I think this is really fascinating. What do you guys think? Robert?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. I think, again, it touches upon the cycling versus switching. And, I always love and welcome sort of head-to-head, whether it's within the class or TNF versus IL-17, or in this case, IL-23. I know those studies are seldom done because of other reasons. And I know when they throw it on onto the study, it's not really powered, but it's always nice because it gives us information as clinicians, what to do exactly in that cycling versus switching. And I think, like you mentioned, Rachel, the topic of this precision medicine really is kind of the what we're searching for. It's the holy grail. And I think there's even ongoing studies, looking at phenotyping patients, based on Th17, and perhaps someone comes in, they are this age, they are this gender with this cellular kind of profile, boom, this is the biologic of choice, instead of doing the typical kind of, called step therapy that we use here in the States. So very exciting, obviously, in the future.
I mean, head-to-heads give you confidence, right? It almost gives you a sense of relief, and that's important too. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? Okay. Well, I want to thank you for your big hits. Now, we do have a little bit more time, so I'm hoping you can give me a quick hit or something you really enjoyed. There were so many really great abstracts. I personally missed the posters. Like, I wish we had them in person. I thought that was really lacking, but what we had was really great. And we had a lot of information. We're looking at subsets of patients, whether it be gender related, to make sure that all of our classifications fit, all the way down to the nitty gritty regarding disease state changes. And then of course with medications. So if you guys can give me one of your last quick hits, what would that be? What do you want our audience to know tonight? I'll start with you, Robert, if you're up.
Yeah, just quickly, this is abstract 0402, focus on opioid use in psoriatic arthritis. Touched upon all the keystones we know about, doesn't work, don't use in psoriatic arthritis, led to more disease state. Sorry, but for me personally, the most interesting thing was they found opioid users who had psoriatic arthritis end up paying more for healthcare costs and medication costs. So I think, we always, we say, no, we're not going to prescribe opioids, it doesn't work. But perhaps should we pause and think, why are they on opioids? If I'm someone who's paying a lot for methotrexate or a biologic, I'm probably not going to pay that. I'm probably going to go the cheaper route. And maybe just my disease is not fully treated, or maybe, my fibromyalgia that someone's treating with Percocet is actually enthesitis, and perhaps we just need to do a deeper dive. So I thought that was actually the kind of interesting part of that abstract.
Patricia, do you have a point on that, Trish?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's something that we probably know of, and even supports, we shouldn't be jumping to opiates. I think that was the key thing I got out of that as well. Yeah.
I agree. Trish, want to give us your last quick hit?
So even in the interest of time, I'm going to give, I suppose, my main take home from ACR 2022. So it wasn't what I went into ACR thinking that it would be my main take home, but I think our management does go beyond medication. So obviously the diet, but also sleep. I know there was a brilliant study done on sleep and the high prevalence of sleep in psoriatic arthritis and how these patients aren't adequately treated for it and the effects that has on disease outcomes. So I do think that we need to look at our patients more holistically, obviously, again, in conjunction with our conventional medicine, but there's more to what we do than just pharmacotherapy. We do need to see the patient more as a whole. That was my main take home.
I mean, I think that resonates for us. Elaine, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I think for me, what really hit is how we're getting closer with our translational studies to influence our clinical studies. And I think that's how I chose some of these abstracts today, was to try to, remind us that we're going to go a lot faster in accelerating discoveries if we work together with basic science and clinical, which has been traditionally, I think, very separate in the past. And I think this meeting now, maybe just because of all the state of the art, products that we have now in terms of looking at molecular differences are highlighted. I just want to give a shout out that I'm really excited to see this kind of basic clinical and then translational work that will help all of us take care of patients.
It's really funny that you would say that, because I was going to end with that comment or something similar, because I finally feel like we're finally picking, that snowball is just really coming, almost like where we were with ACR in like 2017, 2015 with RA. You know, how we started having these more robust conversations, and we're able to talk about this as a disease state and look differently at it. And I really appreciate that. Olga, did you have any last comments?
Yes, I think my takeaway here is, with so many treatment options available, so different approaches to patients, we should be open to individualizing care and being more personalized in approach to our patients. For some person, changing mechanism of action works. For another, combination of medical treatment with the diet. A third person, combination of biologics and non-biologics. So just being open to different approaches to the in each and every case is something that I learned in this meeting.
No, I agree. You guys are rock stars. Team PSA, I am so proud to be a part of your team. This has really been it's been a very unique ACR, right? We had some of us live, we had some of us virtually. I really appreciate your time. As always, I'm a big proponent for sharing your passion and your talent with RheumNow, and I really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to say Team PSA until ACR 2023. I'll see you guys soon, okay?
See you, bye.